Trump's 8-word reversal, the deadline for me is when it's over, has not transformed his approach to Ukraine. It simply removed an artificial deadline that was already collapsing under diplomatic and political pressure. The core idea remains the same: force Kyiv to accept territorial losses and call it peace. What has changed is that Europe has now constructed a counterweight, one grounded not in Trump's timelines, but in law, finance and legitimacy. The Downing Street summit that took place yesterday matters for that reason. Zelensky was not standing alone. He arrived as Trump was publicly chastising him for supposedly not reading the US proposal and claiming that his people love it, while insisting that Putin was fine with it. In London, by contrast, Zelensky stood beside Starmer, Macron and Merz, with NATO and EU chiefs and 7 more European leaders joining by video link. They collectively stressed that any peace must be just and lasting, and that Ukraine must receive robust security guarantees against future Russian aggression. This is a direct challenge to the premise of the US plan, which treats security guarantees as loose concepts and territorial concessions as the inevitable price of ending the war. Where the summit becomes strategically interesting is the pivot from land to assets. More than £180 billion in Russian state funds sit immobilised in European banks after the invasion. The European Commission has proposed using about £78 billion of those funds to raise a reparations-backed loan for Ukraine. Belgium is resisting, as most of the Russian money sits at Euroclear in Brussels, and ministers fear both liability and retaliation. Yet, the united pressure from major European capitals is now intense. Starmer will confront the Belgian Prime Minister this week. Merz has already flown to Brussels to apply pressure in person. The UK stands ready to contribute its own $8 billion in frozen Russian assets if Europe moves together. If this is agreed at an EU summit later this month, Ukraine gains the means to sustain its war effort into next year. Europe gains a moral and legal foundation for a settlement that doesn't reward invasion, and Russia, not Ukraine, becomes the party paying for the damage it's caused. Trump's U-turn, therefore, looks less like conciliation and more like tactical repositioning to avoid the humiliation of a deadline missed. His rhetoric still homes in on the battlefield situation, insisting that Russia now has the upper hand and that certain territories might be gotten by Russia anyway if Ukraine doesn't settle. That message encourages Moscow to believe time is on its side and asks Kyiv to accept the logic of conquest. Zelensky has answered with clarity: Ukraine has no legal or moral right to cede land. He is confronted daily by the graves of those who fought to defend that land, by a constitution that forbids surrender of territory, and by the reality that any concession now would invite new demands later. And Russia ought to understand that logic, because it's put forward a law recently which says that it cannot surrender territory which it has declared as Russian. The US National Security Strategy, released last week, further sharpens the contrast. It stresses the desire to improve relations with Moscow, warns that NATO expansion, and indulges in rhetoric about Europe facing civilizational erasure through migration. And the Kremlin welcomed it. Europe didn't. European leaders are instead talking of increased pressure on Europe, on Russia, deeper integration of Ukraine into European defence structures, and long-term isolation of Putin's regime through the very assets he wants stored abroad for safety. Trump wants movement fast. Europe wants movement right. The current diplomatic tension lies exactly there. There is a way forward, and that is to look at it legally. The Ukrainian legal position is not going to change. The Russian legal position could. All Russia has to do is admit that that law that decreed that the Donbass areas were Russian needs to be abolished, needs to be pulled back. They aren't Russian. You can't declare something that is yours when it simply is not yours. It wasn't even in their possession when they made that law. A ceasefire scribbled around the present front lines may look like peace on paper, but it would bake into the European order the principle that nuclear blackmail and mass violence can redraw borders. A slower peace that is financed by Russian assets and anchored in international law offers at least the possibility of security that endures. Zelensky said that after the Downing Street talks that a small step had been taken towards peace. The real step is that the axis of decision-making is shifting. Peace will no longer be defined by a White House holiday deadline or by the timetables of Trump's envoys. It will be defined by whether Ukraine retains the territory it is fighting for and whether Russia is compelled to pay for the destruction it has inflicted. Trump may say the deadline is when it is over. Europe, by contrast, must insist that it will only be over when justice is done. Justice can only be done by repairing the damage, and that means, in part, returning the property that has been stolen.